Hey folks, this is a cat with charts for sharkcharts.live, and today I'm here to talk to you about compression moving average. I'm really excited about this because this is our first indicator that's brand new and fully ready for prime time that we're releasing since we launched sharkcharts.live to begin with. So I get to show you something that's newer, more experimental, but I think really cool. So compression moving average works similarly to mean reversion moving average, but instead tracks the longest compressed period as defined by wave PM. There are a few subtle differences in how this works that are relevant and require it to be coded a little bit differently as opposed to just adding on as a feature to mean reversion moving average. But there are a lot of similarities. So I've got it set up as 4 different indicators: a 600 max period, a full 2000 period, 600 max period tracker, and a full 2000 max period tracker. Though in contrast to mean reversion moving average, it is very rare to find a chart that it's relevant to use the 2000 period compression moving average. So much more often you can just stick with the 600 max. So first to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework for why we care about even tracking this. So if you recall from the mean reversion moving average video, I used this chart as an example, the US dollar, Canadian dollar pair on the 1 hour as well as the 15-minute to explain one of the various quirks of mean reversion moving average. It turns out it's a great example for what I want to show here as well. And at the time, we actually got that mean reversion roughly complete. And in fact, we got some sideways ranging from there. A weak new trend here that's actually roughly following this period after it compressed. Then a push down, a dip down here. It's a violent reaction off this pivot, and then we're actually back here finding support along the inside of this band, hopefully for another test up. So that's great, and that should be tradable. Cool indicator. Still has an issue though, where this is just one period being shown. It's a very carefully curated, well-selected period, but it's just one period length on one time frame. And you still get all this chop. You get stuff like this that isn't really consistent with our point about mean reversions being predicted as probable. Maybe it's probable, but this is you try to set up your risk reward here, you'd get it wrong. And you can explain that as there are lots of periods that are relevant at any given time and lower time frames all expanding and contracting. But it would be really nice if we could come up with other periods that are relevant and telling us more information from this large set of wave PM readings we're taking. So what are some other things we can look at? So here I've pulled up the high-res 3D wave PM heat map for this chart. It was 240 period. It's the longest overexpanded period here. Indeed, this plume is to 240 period. And here I'd like you to focus on what happens after that plume. So as we start going down and as we start rounding out and becoming less violent, I start to see larger and larger sections of compression. And eventually we start seeing a compression band that comes all the way up. And what's happening here is similar to how with expansion you see one period length after another just expand into each other. When there's an absence of mass and no mass gets applied, mass here being volume, you start to see the one after another, the periods cycle in the other direction where they start compressing. And eventually the trend is exhausted and you just start seeing compression on higher and higher and higher period lengths. And unlike the overexpansion, since this is defined by an absence of volume rather than the presence of volume, this doesn't actually have a distinct final period length. It just kind of keeps going until it gets cleared. Kind of like how darkness isn't an entity, light is an entity that fills a room. You don't have darkness, you don't have cold. You actually have heat or light that expand into an area. It's the same concept. The compression is the absence of something. The expansion is the presence of something. So you can't just pull out one specific period length like you can with an overexpansion. We can overlay the 240 band, and you'll notice that we do really cleanly bounce off it a couple times, but we're having trouble getting further up. Like really clearly, it's getting towards the same higher limit and just having trouble pushing any further up. And we can see in the 3D Wave PM heat map that it's bumping into this compression band and it's not clearing it. This is what you'll hear Dad Shark referred to in the YouTube videos as compression overhead. And all that means essentially is that these higher period lengths are compressing in opposition to what these expanding periods are trying to do. So this series of rolling compressions at higher and higher period lengths hits into a brick wall because there's a really large amount of opposition from the higher period lengths compressing volatility that without a lot of mass they don't clear. Usually it takes several runs at this wall before it actually clears it. And noting that Wave PM is and the volatility is non-directional in and of itself, these runs are taking both directions and price to actually occur. Volatility is the amount of movement, so it makes sense, right? That it could be in both directions. It should be in both, if likely will be in both directions. So we are in this area effectively range bound by this overhead compression. So the idea with compression moving average is let's track the longest compressed period and see how that acts as a mean reversion pivot. And it indeed does. There's kind of two distinct phases. And I'll the mean reversion moving average loading up so you can see how they interact. There's this set of small expansions where we've tracked a very low compression length underneath an expansion. So you're defining very local trending. It's not the same tightly adhered to pivot that the mean reversion pivots frequently are. But the overall behavior is fairly similar where, eventually it follows the 1.25 standard deviation pretty well, and occasionally mean reverts tests. In those cases, you get a bout of a compression that often leads to a larger band on this indicator, successfully larger bands until it starts rounding out, and then eventually you see a large continuous band take shape as this trend is exhausted. And then you find yourself in a clear compression range. And it's hard at this point, knowing what you know there, to know that at this point that you should sell here. But if you're looking for places as a range is developed, to take profits or to start setting up risk rewards under high compression situations, then it starts becoming really relevant that you've got this clear compression range that's been well defined. Because say that if it can't get a clean break from this area, and it's signaling mean reversion here, well, it's most likely going to test all the way down to the bottom of the range if it gets going. So it starts becoming probable that your other target is the other end of this range. So you start defining additional pivots that can be used sensibly alongside mean reversion moving average and 3D wave PM. This is developing quite nicely as I'm talking to cleanly bounce off two different pivots as predicted on this chart. I didn't plan for that, and it's a nice little thing to see just in real time. So another chart shows this quite well is the BTC USD 4-hour chart, where we get a wonderful example of how you can overexpand a period so far that mean reversion moving average is not in of itself actively useful for trading all of this stuff that's happening in the meantime. This overexpansion started in November. It was a massive overexpansion. This is a regular 3D wave PM capped at 600 period, and it's up to 1730. So in the mean reversion moving average video, I explained that you gotta slice and dice mean reversion moving average to smaller time frames, capped lookbacks to make use of it when situations like this arise. Compression moving average is an option for quickly coming up with relevant pivot points from the volatility perspective to use alongside, especially when you've got a defined trend. We know we're trending below this. Compression moving average here gets a mean reversion, reacts down, predicts a mean reversion, kind of get it, reacts down, predicts a mean reversion. We cross. This is like a 20 to 30% move, something like that, 25-30% move. So it is more reactive, and it did catch that you did not want to stay short past this point if you were still short. But eventually, as we start reactivating trend, it picks it up. It notices we continue roughly following along that pivot, though not exactly. We react up, and then by this point, we have our long period compression overhead band, and it's defining a nice clean range. And moreover, the mean on that period length, which has been a changing period length from all the way from 200 to 415 as of present, has been a relevant pivot this entire time, where action is centered and repeatedly wicked to. And it's making a very interesting prediction right now. I'll be following this personally to see how it plays out. That here, we've actually crashed to on long time frames is the weekly 200 moving average, and we've been predicting in shark charts repeated retests of the weekly 200 moving average as a possible bottoming picture for BTC USD this year. But it's predicting here that what we might actually see is a violent reaction back up, where one target would be the 415 moving average, and then another likely target is this confluence pivot between the longest overexpanded period, 1.25 standard deviation, and the compression range top. which sets up a fairly nice risk reward scenario where you could enter along here, presumably, and on the idea that this compression moving average will roughly hold. You get a little less than 3 to 1, I think, if you could put it below the weekly 200 moving average. Yeah, about 4,100, about 3. So you could set up a potential long position here on the bet that we'd bounce off this pivot as a relatively tight stop as one possible way you could use this. It also would lead an additional credibility to the notion that if we were to print a candle up here to 4,200, 4,300, that you should probably be betting on trend continuation to do a full mean reversion all the way to 6,000, because we would have likely broken out of the compression overhead at the same time that we'd have crossed the pivot for mean reversion. So it's an additional layer of information that gives you a bunch of stuff you could trade all along the way while having this larger mean reversion picture in mind. So just quickly getting into the settings of compression moving average. The mean reversion moving average allows you to track the previous longest overextended period. There's not much relevance to doing that in compression moving average because it's not a distinct number. It's a moving target defined by the absence of mass. But I do have it replaced with a different color scheme, in fact, by just tracking what the current highest compressed period now is, taking the liberty of going ahead and loading that up so that it doesn't take a minute to load up. And here it shows it as a magenta moving average with green range. What this is useful for is just quickly looking on the chart and defining periods or defining areas under tight compression scenarios where you can roughly define a range with a middle pivot, as well as be aware that a breakout of that range is likely a breakout of significant compression. And in a lot of cases, you do see fairly violent reactions when we do break from it. It does have a weakness versus just tracking the longest compressed period in that when your higher periods on the compression plume are kind of flickering right around the threshold of being read as compressed or not by 3D wave PM, that it turns on and off on those period lengths, whereas the compression moving average tracking tracks it relatively continuously. So I did have one other chart to bring up, and that's the ETH USD chart by comparison to BTC USD. So the ETH USD chart never actually got as compressed at as high a period length. This is the 1 hour versus the 4 hour as BTC USD did. It did get somewhat compressed after this move here, but along this whole way, ETH BTC was slowly selling off, and there was a bit of a downward weighting that was occurring all the way back here. And around this point, we stopped tracking higher and higher compression periods. And finally here, as we started to go parabolic, it really cleanly catches the spot where we're starting to overexpand shorter periods, at the same time we're leaving a compression range. And you could have taken, if you spotted this, a margin short somewhere in this area as a scalp, and you would have been fairly high probability to see some fuel from clearing the compression help you down. If we turn these off for a second to let's look at what this looks at in our regular BBML mix default 50 and 200 period band weighting, you can really clearly see that this whole time as we were compressing this typical set of period lengths, we were weighting down, and eventually when we did expand, the high probability thing was that we would expand to the downside, and that happened. By contrast, on BTC USD, we're still so compressed, and our current action remains, at least at this recording, defined within the predicted compression range. Obviously, if we start violently breaking this down on high volume, that would suggest, for the same reasons that ETH USD broke down, it would be kind of a nightmare fuel scenario where we have all the fuel in the world now from this relatively deep compression. Not horribly unlike the compression that preceded the November dump, though less, but similar scale of period lengths. That you can see a fairly violent reactivation downwards, but you also have the prediction here, by contrast, that we're still very well range bound, and part of clearing our volatility overhead could involve actually some ranging up to retest this pivot very cleanly. So that's compression moving average, and I'm happy to be able to bring it to you guys here at sharkcharts.live.